discussion, which will be followed then by the keynote address at 3:45. I believe Raymond Mohammed is sick, and so I don't think he will be making it today. So Lara has been granted the time she needs to finish her presentation, and then we'll also have time for any questions, further discussion that we can ask some of the other panelists who are still here, or further perspectives on truth, that sort of ever-fleeting subject. So Laura Kline is another of my colleagues in classical and modern languages, literatures, and cultures. As one of the first to research the life and works of the Soviet prison camp writer, Varlam Shalamov. She began studying Shalamov in the early 1990s when very little was known about him, either in Russia or abroad. She received an IREX grant in 1994 to conduct research for a year in Russia, and spent that time working in the archives in Moscow and interviewing camp survivors and members of the cultural elite and dissident circles with which Shalamov was associated. In 1998, she completed a dissertation on Shalamov's life and works and received a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from the University of Michigan. Since that time, she's continued to research and study Russian prison camp literature and Shalamov's life and works in particular. This month, and in fact, I think maybe last week,
yes,
she gave a paper on Shalamov at a conference in Prague, so she has jetted back to join us. And is fighting her jet lag to make the presentation. She was also the recipient of a 2011 WSU President's Award for Excellence in Teaching. So please join me in welcoming Laura Kline.
Between 1928 and 1953, millions of innocent people suffered and died in the labor and death camps of the Stalinist Gulag. Numerous memoirs and a handful of fictional works have been written by survivors about their experiences in these camps. Most are focused on remembering those who did not survive and establishing the truth of the mass tragedy that the Soviet regime tried and successfully managed to suppress until the 1980s. These works are normally chronologically organized traditional narratives, chronicling the author's experience from his arrest to his release. In this context, Russian-Soviet writer and poet Varlam Shalamov's 6 cycles of short stories, collectively known as the Kolyma tales, are somewhat of an anomaly. Straddling the line between fact and fiction, the cycles contain a series of disconnected, disorganized, and horrific events which are presented by an emotionally detached narrative voice, creating a dark, closed, and disorienting literary universe. Shalamov shared the goals of his fellow survivors, but in a society where truth was purposefully and systematically distorted by the regime, he felt that the only truth a person could legitimately convey was the psychological truth of his experience. In other words, his own physical, emotional, and cognitive apprehension of his experience. For him, a text based on cognitively processed material was already a distorted view of the truth. Consequently, Shalamov created a text based on his raw apprehension of his experience in order to reveal the devastating effects of nearly 2 decades of severe trauma on his psyche. Shalamov was born in 1907, only a decade before the Russian Revolution. While a university student, he was arrested for his involvement in an underground anti-Stalinist organization and spent 3 years in a prison camp. After his release, he gave up politics and began working as a journalist. 6 years later, he was arrested for the same crime and sentenced to the notorious labor camps of Kolyma in the Far East. He would spend over 14 years there, for the majority of the time performing hard labor, working in the mines and felling timber. Many times he was near death. At one of his worst moments, he weighed 105 pounds, even though he was nearly 6 feet tall and did not have a slight frame. His normal weight was 176. Soon after his release in 1951, he began work on what would become 6 cycles of short stories about his experience. These stories would circulate illegally among members of the Soviet intelligentsia and be smuggled abroad, but they would not be published in the Soviet Union until the late 1980s because of censorship. In this paper, I will examine his first cycle, which was written closest to the time of his release, to demonstrate Shalamov's presentation of the psychological truth of trauma. The term trauma was initially used to describe a physical wound caused by an extrinsic agent. Expanded by Sigmund Freud and Pierre Janet in the late 19th century to include psychic wounds, the term is used today to describe events that threaten or cause death or serious injury to a person or others near him and induce a state of intense fear, helplessness, or terror. In the 1970s, when a spectrum of disorders was observed in Vietnam veterans, the long-term effects of trauma were classified as PTSD. The main disorders associated with PTSD are hyperarousal, which is the persistent expectation of danger, intrusion, the indelible imprint of the traumatic moment, and constriction, emotional numbing and the avoidance of memories of the trauma. According to psychiatrist Judith Herman, these disorders are particularly severe after long-term and repeated trauma, such as occurs in concentration camps. Constantly faced with new threats, these victims are forced to live in a prolonged state of hyperarousal. In this state, memories are extremely vivid and deeply imprinted, like childhood memories, yet nonverbal, because during trauma, the brain shuts down less critical areas, such as those responsible for linguistic encoding. The state of constriction is also extremely pronounced in victims of chronic trauma. Unable to escape or protect themselves from danger and pain, victims retreat from the world into a state of psychic numbness. They cease struggling, detach emotionally, numb their physical perceptions, and suppress their thoughts, especially those which relate to life outside, the past, and the future. They live in the immediate present and are only aware of those things that directly impact their survival. After the traumatic experience is ended, many survivors remain in this constricted state, attempting to suppress memories of the trauma just as they attempted to detach from the trauma while it was occurring. But the more survivors try to repress the memories, the more they intrude on their lives in the form of flashbacks and nightmares. Survivors thus find themselves living in the present and the past simultaneously. Traumatic experiences also destroy the positive beliefs most people hold about themselves and the nature of the world. In her landmark book, Shattered Assumptions, Ronnie Janoff-Bullman argues that during childhood we develop a set of core assumptions, the most important of which are, the world is benevolent, the world is meaningful, the self is worthy. It is difficult and even dangerous to change these assumptions because they form the basis of what she describes as a conceptual system that provides us with expectations about the world and ourselves, guides our interactions in the world, and generally enables us to function effectively, end of quote. It is precisely these basic assumptions that are shattered by trauma. After being subject to and witnessing repeated acts of violence and cruelty, victims may lose faith in the benevolent and meaningful nature of the world. Long-term abuse and isolation changes victims psychologically, and some are forced to compromise their moral values. Consequently, many survivors suffer a crisis of self-esteem and even identity. Recently, psychologists have begun approaching trauma treatment from the standpoint of narrative. They argue that story-making is a universal human activity, without which we could not make sense out of our world or construct our identity. According to this theory, each person creates, largely unconsciously, a coherent, internalized life narrative which defines his or her purpose and place in the world. At the basis of this narrative are our core assumptions. No doubt the original prototype for literature, the life story shares the same attributes of traditional literary works: setting, scenes, character, plot, and theme. Over time, each significant new event is, I quote, encoded in a verbal linear narrative that is assimilated into the ongoing life story, end of quote. This, however, is not the case with traumatic events, which are beyond normal experience and difficult to assimilate. Moreover, as they are generally nonverbal, disorganized, and incomplete, it is impossible to incorporate them into a complete narrative. Clinical studies confirm that whereas the narratives of those who have not suffered trauma are linear, coherent, logical, and complete, narratives of trauma victims tend to lack a beginning, middle, and end, appropriate affect, character, sequential events with cause and effect, and meaning. Narrative trauma therapy involves the creation and revision of narratives about the traumatic experience with the goal of creating a complete narrative about them, and then integrating that complete narrative into the larger life story. Therapy begins with an examination of the survivor's life before the trauma. Then the survivor must face the trauma itself. The factual elements of the experience are reconstructed and organized, and the survivor must remember attendant emotions and physical sensations. Finally, the survivor must rebuild shattered assumptions about himself and the world and find meaning in the traumatic experience. One could argue that narratives written by survivors for therapeutic diagnosis and treatment are fundamentally different than literary texts. Yet literature and treatment narratives are not so different when the authors survive the traumatic experience he is describing. And recent studies have examined literary novels such as All Quiet on the Western Front, using techniques from narrative therapy. In fact, for Shalamov, it was precisely the semi-fictional text that had the flexibility to communicate the full scope of the psychological trauma. I will thus approach Shalamov's Kolyma tales from the point of view of PTSD and narrative therapy to demonstrate that they offer a particularly revelatory picture of the experience of trauma. The most prevalent marker of PTSD in Kolyma tales is constriction. As Kolyma tales are largely based on Shalamov's own experience, one might expect to encounter a single narrator or main character in the cycle representing the author. Instead, there are several different main narrators and main characters, all of whom are fragments of a meta-hero who is clearly based on Shalamov himself. Some of these narrators speak in the first person and some in the third. They move from first to third person narration, the move from first to third person narration reflects the meta-hero's periodic retreats from his story. Sometimes he is participant, but sometimes he is only a witness to his own life. This is a marker of constriction, or emotional distancing. The first-person narrator also shows signs of constriction. More often than not, he says we, rather than I. This reflects a loss of identity and individuality in the degrading conditions of prison camps. It may also be a type of distancing, as it is less painful to blend with the collective and write about the general fate than the personal one. The narrative point of view is also influenced by trauma. Sometimes the point of view is determined by one of several survivors who write in the past tense, and sometimes by one of several victims who intrude into the psyche of the survivors like a series of flashbacks and tell about the Gulag in the present tense. This reveals that the meta-hero has not yet come to terms with the past and, like a survivor suffering from PTSD, is living in two realities simultaneously. The thematic focus of the cycle is also influenced by constriction. Whereas in typical Gulag memoirs, survivors attempt to give a detailed and organized description of camp life, in Kolyma tales this is not the case. Here, the various incarnations of the meta-hero have retreated into themselves and shut out everything not directly related to the fight for survival, such as memories about the past, thoughts about the future, or the world beyond the Gulag, and even non-essential details about camp life. Because of the prisoner's tunnel vision, the raw material for the complex narrative of the events, the complete narrative of the events was never recorded, and Shalamov refuses to complete the incomplete images in his brain for the reader. The events recorded in camp memoirs naturally elicit feelings of pain and horror in the reader. However, that may not have been the case for the victim as he experienced them. Instead, because of constriction, he may have perceived horrific events without emotion or distress. This is reflected in Shalamov's stories, as the narrators relate episodes of suffering, death, and mutilation in a dispassionate, almost casual voice, without commenting or dwelling on them. Moreover, the most horrific events are not about the meta-hero, but other prisoners, perhaps because it is less painful to write about them. For example, in Cherry Brandy, the story with the most detailed depiction of suffering in the cycle, slow death from starvation, the person depicted is not the meta-hero, but Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. Although Shalamov clearly drew on his own experience for this piece, he does not acknowledge this suffering as his own. Not only Shalamov the prisoner, but Shalamov the survivor cannot face all the aspects of his trauma on an emotional level, and is also suffering from constriction. The typical Gulag memoir is chronologically organized, usually beginning with the survivor's arrest and ending with his release. It is also organized geographically, following the author from one camp to the next. Shalamov's cycle, however, lacks cohesion in terms of chronology, space, narration, or, as we have seen, character. This more closely reflects what happens during trauma, as events are apprehended during hyperarousal when the brain is unable to properly evaluate or categorize experience, and a complete narrative of the experience is not formed. The cycle also lacks a beginning and an end, as the reader is never presented with the circumstances of the meta-hero's arrest, or anything before that, or his release. Thus, not only is there no complete narrative of the traumatic experience, it isn't woven into the fabric of the meta-hero's life on either end, and thus exists outside of his life story. Many, although not all, authors of Gulag narratives express at least some positive emotions about their experience. Some feel a sense of victory by virtue of having stood up to an oppressive regime. Others discovered the good in their fellow man. And still others see the possibility of purification through suffering. However, among survivors, as opposed to those who write memoirs, these more positive evaluations are rare and generally come only after survivors have processed their trauma, at least to a certain degree. The author of Kolyma Tales, however, believed that nothing good ever came from the camps, and that the camp experience only destroys what is good. This conviction is reflected in the experience of Shalamov's metahero, whose core assumptions have been shattered. He presents a world filled with constant and arbitrary brutality, suffering, and death, where it is impossible to maintain the assumption that the world is benevolent or meaningful. Moreover, in this world, it is not merely the government or the guards who behave violently and immorally. Time and again, the prisoners rob, squeal on, beat, and even kill one another. Thus, suffering is proven not to ennoble, as maintained by other writers, Orthodox Christianity, and professional writers from Dostoevsky to Solzhenitsyn, but to debase. In fact, the camps have proven, claims Shalamov, that man is not the elevated being he was believed to be. Rather, what distinguishes him from animals is nothing more than his physical superiority, as he is better able to endure hardship. In other words, not only is the world hostile, but man is not worthy. Thus, in Kolyma Tales, Shalamov has effectively communicated raw trauma which has not been processed or transcended. The truth of trauma is not, however, completely negative. The metahero has not been completely destroyed by his experience, as his own self-respect remains surprisingly intact. The narrator says, at the end of the cycle, I quote, "It was here that he understood that he is worth something, that he can respect himself. Here he was, still alive, and he hadn't betrayed or sold out anyone, either during interrogation or in the camp," end of quote. In other words, his self is worthy, and it is worthy because of his adherence to moral values. Morality thus presents meaning, order, and identity in the midst of chaos, degradation, and evil, something also mentioned by psychologist and Auschwitz survivor Viktor Frankl. Shalamov thus also makes us privy to the importance of morality for him as a source of strength in the camps. Poetry turns out to be another personal source of strength in the midst of trauma. Poetry takes on an almost religious importance for the metahero, who describes it as his last salvation and the life-affirming power that he lived by. This is related to his acmeist understanding of culture as the pinnacle of human achievement, and thus a counterpoise to the degradation of the camps. But it is also because poetry provides beauty, order, and meaning in the midst of terror and death. This understanding of culture is perhaps at least partially responsible for Shalamov's decision not to write a purely autobiographical work. Instead, by blending fact and fiction, he effectively conveys the psychological truth about the tragedy of his life and simultaneously elevates the horrific past to the level of literature, transforming and purifying it. In his Kolyma Tales, Shalamov reveals the truth about the psychological hell he endured during and after 17 years in the Gulag and the sources of strength which helped him survive. But the psychological significance of Shalamov's stories goes far beyond the trauma of one man. His vivid, merciless depictions of the camps were some of the first pieces of testimony about the Gulag encountered by his fellow countrymen. As such, they can be seen as a series of flashbacks from the past of an entire nation, which broke through the wall of government-enforced silence. Each person who reads them participates in the integration of the Stalinist era into the broader fabric of Russian history. Thus, by telling the truth about his own past and creating his trauma narrative, Shalamov made some of the first steps to recovery for his fellow survivors and for his nation. And along these same lines, I just wanted to mention that the image here I used of the camps in the very beginning of the PowerPoint and here at the end, I tried to do along Shalamov lines. In other words, this is my experience. When I was in Prague, we went an hour outside of Prague to a prison camp called Kolyma prison camp. So this is not where Shalamov was in prison. This is where I visited, and also caught a very bad cold. I don't know anyway.
Thank you, Laura. So, to open the floor for questions.
So, I think the entire article is pretty much similar how we look at how one person trying to remember, or how one country trying to remember. So, I'm I'm wondering if this novel provides some kind of detailed narrative for other survivors, for other survivors.
In what way a detailed narrative?
I mean, from his narrative, that provides some kind of detailed description about what he went through. And so for other survivors, they might, whether it's possible for other survivors, they just use this version of description.
Oh, and not write their own?
Yeah, because it will become so that they don't need to recollect the unavailable past, and then they can move forward.
You know, that's an interesting question. The one thing that I can say in response is that, in my personal knowledge, there are not a lot of Gulag survivors who are alive, and we don't know about the reactions of a lot of them to this, but they tend not to like the Kolyma tales. They tend to argue against them. They tend to be very dissatisfied with them, so I don't think it can stand for their own story. In fact, I think it makes them want to write what they see to be the truth, because what he's done here is this slight fictionalization. I think in order to explain his own psychological condition, he has changed names because it better reflects his understanding of the truth, but therefore it conflicts with somebody else's, right? Or he remembers incidences, I think very much the way we remember the past. You know, if you tell a story from long ago, you might tell it once one way, the second time another way. He does this, you'll see these repetitions and they're told in different ways. Maybe none of them actually correspond to what another person believes is the truth, right? So what Kolyma Tales did was elicit a lot of angry letters during Shalamov's lifetime, and since then there are still people who are publishing their maybe short memoirs explaining where he went wrong, which is very interesting. So it's very personal. It's very personal what he's done. But I think it's more important not for other survivors, at least not in the way that you're talking about, but for the people who weren't in the camps, right? It allows them, when you read his tales, and every time I reread them, I feel this more and more, you feel like you're going through a psychological hell. He's managed to create this on the paper, right? And maybe that's too much for the other survivors too. Maybe they don't want to go there, right? I mean, for them, for most of them, forgetting is the best thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are so many commonalities. I mean, I'm focusing right now on children's literature for Holocaust, but I've been working with memoirs, you know, overall, and I've taught, you know, a variety of Holocaust literature courses through the decades. I'm reminded of Elena's question earlier about common understanding about related to a text perhaps or something like that. And I was thinking about my response earlier and feeling it wasn't accurate to the question and respond to the question. My sense of it as a Holocaust scholar and having done a lot of reading and research is that there can't be a common understanding. It's a kaleidoscope of understandings. And what you just said is really fascinating, that people should be angry, I think, I don't know if use that word or some other word, with him for expressing what he did the way he did. He wrote stories, so as I said with regard to children's literature of the Holocaust, very often fiction is more effective with children, certainly, than nonfiction or historical, you know, information presented in a documentary. But the reality is that every person's experience is unique. If one doesn't accept that, then one isn't living on this planet, really.
But with the survivors, I'm afraid that they're a tough lot in general. The Gulag survivors in general, they are very critical in a lot of ways, and they're hard. Shalamov was a hard person. I mean, he didn't accept anybody else's work either. Do you know what I mean? So I don't think they were at that point where something like let's accept everybody's point of view and be open-minded about it was important at all. Like each of them, if they were going to talk about the truth, it was going to be the truth of the capital T's. They saw it. They were not compromising. They got it argued. It's very different, I think, than the Holocaust situation too, because first of all, it lasted much longer. Second of all, the people who were implicated were people from the same background in many cases, right? It wasn't one group treating another group in a different way. Third of all, people didn't manage to escape maybe to the United States or even to a free Germany after the war or something like that, right? They were still in the country, so this was hidden, covered up. And the people who had the guts to keep thinking about it and talking about it when everybody else wanted them to be quiet, the government and other people, right? They're a tough lot. They're really a tough lot. Everyone will tell you, it's easy to fall on their bad side. When I was doing research in the mid-90s, I was walking a tightrope all the time because they could get offended at anything, even by who you talk to. Oh, you talk to that person. Well, what did they tell you? And what do you think about it? So I think it's a different situation, and there's never been a real public acknowledgement of what these people went through. Right? It's been very much scripted to the side. Nobody's been held accountable for this. Right? Whereas we have a different situation with the Holocaust. And at this point now, they're pushing back. So.
There's another question, Matt.
I have read that 20 million people died in this Russian genocide, and that it's the largest genocide of all time. Can you say anything? What is your best guess as to how many people died in this genocide?
It is, first of all, I don't know if it's technically a genocide. There was a Ukrainian genocide, right, where most recent figures, we heard it lecture the other day, 3 or 4 million, but maybe more. Nobody really knows. Millions died in the camps. The Russians say millions at this point. Western scholars have said, I don't know, 20 million, but that's probably high. I don't know. I mean, maybe 10 million. But to put a figure on it is impossible. And I think at this point it doesn't matter so much. First of all, because when you start putting the figures on, I've discovered this in myself, when you start focusing on the figures, you forget that every one of them was a life like this. Every single one of them. If it's 10 million or 20 million, do we feel any difference? The second thing is that some of the lowest figures that have been revealed are those that were discovered by Anne Applebaum, who wrote a book called Gulag relatively recently. And she says, I think 2.5 million, something like that. Now she bases this all on archives. Archives were falsified, documents were destroyed. I have seen photocopies of documents that say falsify other documents. Right? So if we take that, I really admire what she did. She went through a lot, but we don't know that they're showing us everything. As the KGB says today, nothing has changed. It's only changed for you, but it hasn't changed for us. And they're getting stronger, and you know what I mean? They're not letting everything out. It's embarrassing. It's a problem, right, for them. So a figure, I think millions is the best answer. That's what I would say for all of the tragedies that happened in the Soviet period. It's millions, every single one of them. World War I. The Civil War, collectivization, the purges, World War II. World War II, we can say maybe 29 million. That's the only one, and that still keeps changing.
Yeah. Sorry. So just understand your theory, your trauma theory as it relates to Shalamov's work. So that sort of rift that you show in the narrative, linearity, that's caused by trauma, which I understand in his particular version of narrative. It's not exactly healed by a narrative that then imposes linearity in experience, but does it in some way still fill in the gap in his life narrative but just in a sort of a different way.
Was he healed by his narrative? Is that what you're asking? So I just talked about this with people at this conference in Prague, and they're the best in the field, and some people came up to me and were saying things like, he was never healed, and I would agree with that. He was never healed. He didn't want it to be a trauma narrative the way I'm talking about it. I'm analyzing it from that point of view, but he purposely tried to keep all the painful memories alive because he felt that that was his moral duty. And I think that it's possible he tried not to recover. He actually writes in one of his stories that the easy thing is to remember the good and forget the bad, and most people forget, but I will not forget. And I feel in myself that desire to forget, but I will not forget. On the other hand, I would say that he wrote 6 cycles. And as we move through these cycles, we see the narratives becoming more and more traditional. We see, more and more of the I as opposed to the we. So there was definitely some progress. But half of his trauma, this is a whole other can of words, but half of his trauma happened after the camp, which I think was probably worse than in the camps for him. His marriage fell apart, his child never acknowledged him, he became popular for a short period of time. He was outchatted by Solzhenitsyn, who he thought was a lesser writer. He ended up, he had a very difficult character. He ended up breaking with everyone that he knew. He ended up in a nursing home, which didn't happen to anybody back then in the Soviet Union unless they had no living relatives. It wasn't done. He lived there in terrible conditions and ended up dying in a psychiatric ward. So, you know what I mean? So, on the one hand, you could say, he was sort of healing. On the other hand, he was breaking down physically from 1957. Everything, every organ was damaged. He eventually went blind, deaf, his whole body shook, he couldn't walk straight. He started thinking he was back in the camps. He started hiding food under his bed and it would rot. He thought other people in the barracks, other prisoners would steal it. He would put towels around his neck because in the camps they didn't have scarves and it was cold, right? So, did he ever heal? I would say no, and I would say that's probably the general. But he didn't try to. He tried to write. He wrote until he died, and I think he managed to hold on to life for another, till 1982, from 57 when he got sick. He managed to hold on just so he could write.
The subject matter that I'm just dealing with just reduces anything I have to say trivial, inconsequentiality. What is it that he had against Solzhenitsyn? Now, I mean, my suspicion is that you said something very interesting. He wants to keep the pain alive, and he's willing to live to keep the pain alive, and that is a wicked aesthetic to apply to a person. I would say that's the answer to my question, but what is the answer?
I think that you hit the nail on the head. If you read Solzhenitsyn, you ever notice that you don't suffer while you read it? You actually uplift it, right? And you don't perceive it as suffering, right? It's something else, and it's a very traditional narrative. It has a nice beginning, middle, and end. Yes, it's more complex than that, but nonetheless, he at the very least is healed. At the very least is healed. He's put it into a nice, neat, compartmentalized kind of narrative where
he lived in New England.
He lived in New England, right? Oh, he wrote that in Russia.
Yeah.
But he also wrote, he made the camps look better than they were so that they would get published. One of the great lines that Shalamov was horrified by was the fact that they were talking about the spoons in the camps in Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And Shalamov's response in a letter is, "You had spoons in your camps. I would have done anything for a spoon, you know." It turns out there is a spoon in one of Shalamov's stories, so we all kind of see that as a little bit of correction to his statement. But nonetheless, the camps were definitely kind of rosy. What Shalamov writes about was much worse. Shalamov tried to publish his works at the same time that Solzhenitsyn did and was not allowed, which shows that the censors also sensed a difference. And I think that he also didn't like the political aspects of Solzhenitsyn's work, and he thought that he was using literature and his experience in an unethical way. So there were just so many ways that he diverged, and there was also jealousy. There was also jealousy because he thought he believed before the camps he would be a great writer. When he was young, everyone believed he would be a great writer, right? This was the future Shakespeare, the future Pushkin, as his teachers told him. And then he could only write about the camps because that's what he had.
Very nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of our panelists and to all of those of you who are here to listen and ask questions. You can make it in time to hear distinguished Professor Robert Sudler in the other room, if you would like, speaking about truth in the First Amendment. At 3:45, there will be the keynote address by Lee Wilkins, and at 5 o'clock, a reception to which you are all cordially and warmly invited. So please join us for more of this 20th anniversary celebration, and thank you again.